Chapter 1. The Night Shift. The restaurant was nearly empty when the clock passed midnight, settling into the tired quiet that followed a long day. Bob's Big Boy on East Colorado Street glowed under fluorescent lights, its booths mostly vacant, and its air heavy with the lingering smell of fryer oil and coffee. Outside, the parking lot reflected the yellow wash of street lamps, the familiar statue standing watch at the corner of the property. Inside, the remaining employees worked through the final routines of the shift. A cook scraped the grill clean. A waitress stacked plates behind the counter and glanced occasionally toward the dining room. In the small office, the shift manager counted cash from the register, marking totals and preparing to close. It was late, slow, and unremarkable. Bob's Big Boy was not a place where danger was expected. It was a family restaurant, a landmark, somewhere teenagers lingered, and police officers stopped in for pie. Violence belonged elsewhere. That assumption lingered quietly in the background, shaping how everyone inside understood the night. Shortly after 1 a.m, 3 young men entered through the front doors. They moved without urgency, appearing comfortable in the space. One wore a dark jacket, another kept his hands in his pockets, and the third scanned the room as they walked. Nothing about their entrance drew immediate attention. That changed when one of the men produced a handgun. The mood shifted instantly. Conversation stopped, chairs scraped, and fear replaced routine. There was no confusion now. This was a robbery. The men issued calm commands, directing employees toward the back of the restaurant. Some were told to lie face down, others to kneel near the counters. One worker hesitated briefly before the raised gun clarified the situation. Compliance followed quickly. Money was taken from the register, then the safe, then wallets and pockets. The amount was small, typical for a late-night diner. For the employees, the logic was simple. Give them what they want, and they will leave. They did not. Instead, the men pushed everyone farther into the kitchen, away from windows and doors. Stainless steel counters pressed cold against shaking hands. The hum of refrigeration units filled the silence as the men tightened their control of the room. The first gunshot shattered it. The sound echoed violently off metal surfaces. One employee collapsed immediately. More shots followed in rapid succession, the noise blurring together as panic spread too late to matter. The shooters advanced deliberately, firing as they moved. There was no shouting or hesitation. Each step brought another shot. Each shot, another body falling to the floor. One employee broke free and ran for the walk-in freezer, slamming the heavy door shut behind him. Inside the dark enclosure, the gunfire was muffled but unmistakable, vibrating through the metal walls. When the shots stopped, silence returned. Minutes later, the freezer door opened onto devastation. 5 people lay dead in the kitchen, their bodies scattered across the tile where they had been working moments earlier. Blood pooled beneath them, while the restaurant's machines continued their steady hum. The men responsible were already gone. They exited through the front doors and disappeared into the parking lot beneath the streetlights. The Big Boy statue remained fixed in its familiar smile. When police arrived, the scene was baffling. The dining area was largely untouched. Tables stood upright. The violence existed only in the back, hidden from view. It quickly became clear this was not a robbery that went wrong. It was a robbery that ended exactly as intended. Glendale had never experienced anything like it, and nothing about the night had warned of what was coming. This is AI True Crime, and this is the Bob's Big Boy Massacre. Chapter 2. The Immediate Aftermath. Police arrived at Bob's Big Boy to a scene that did not resemble most homicide investigations. The dining area looked ordinary, almost peaceful, with booths upright and trays still resting on tables. It was only after officers moved toward the back of the restaurant that the scale of the violence became clear. The kitchen told a different story. 5 employees lay where they had fallen, their bodies scattered across the tile floor. Blood pooled beneath stainless steel counters and along the base of the walls. The smell of gunpowder, mixed with grease and cleaning chemicals, creating an atmosphere that felt both industrial and unreal. The surviving employee emerged from the walk-in freezer in shock. He was shaking, struggling to speak, and barely able to explain what he had witnessed. Officers quickly realized they were dealing with a mass killing, not a robbery that had escalated unexpectedly. Glendale police secured the scene and called in additional units. Detectives arrived within minutes, followed by supervisors and crime scene technicians. The restaurant was sealed off, the parking lot flooded with patrol cars and flashing lights that cut sharply against the darkness. Initial interviews began immediately. Employees who had left earlier in the evening were tracked down. Nearby businesses were contacted. Officers canvassed the surrounding area, searching for anyone who might have seen 3 young men leaving the restaurant or entering a vehicle. Descriptions were limited. The attack had unfolded quickly. The perpetrators had not worn masks, but fear and chaos distorted memory. Clothing, height, and hair color varied, depending on who was asked. No license plate numbers were recorded. No clear direction of escape emerged. Inside the restaurant, evidence was collected carefully, but under intense pressure. Spent shell casings were recovered from the kitchen floor. Bullet impacts were photographed. Investigators documented the positions of the bodies, noting the deliberate nature of the shootings and the close-range wounds. The brutality of the crime stunned officers. Robberies were common, executions were not. The controlled manner in which the victims had been killed suggested intent beyond theft. This realization shaped the investigation almost immediately. News of the massacre spread quickly through Glendale. By morning, reporters gathered outside the restaurant, broadcasting images of the familiar landmark now surrounded by police tape. Residents woke to headlines describing a violence the city had never experienced. Families of the victims began arriving at the scene and at police headquarters, desperate for information. Officers struggled to provide answers they did not yet have. Names were withheld until formal notifications could be completed, but word traveled fast. As the sun rose, investigators faced a sobering reality. There were no suspects in custody. No vehicle had been identified. The surviving witness could describe events, but not the men themselves with precision. The restaurant became both a crime scene and a symbol. A place associated with comfort and routine had been transformed overnight into the site of the deadliest mass shooting in the city's history. From the beginning, the pressure to solve the case was immense. Glendale demanded answers, the families demanded justice, and detectives knew that the longer the killers remained unidentified, the more difficult the path forward would become. The investigation had begun. Chapter 3. The suspects emerge. Within hours of the massacre, investigators began reconstructing the movements of everyone who had been inside Bob's Big Boy that night. Time cards were pulled from the restaurant office, receipts were examined, and statements were collected from employees who had already gone home. Detectives worked to narrow the timeline to the exact window between the final normal customer interaction and the moment the 3 men entered through the front doors. The nature of the killings immediately shaped the investigation. Robberies at late-night restaurants were familiar territory, but this crime followed a different logic. The victims were compliant. Money had already been surrendered, yet the shootings occurred afterward, methodical and close range. That detail pushed detectives toward a troubling conclusion. The killings were intentional acts meant to leave no witnesses behind. Ballistics analysis confirmed the use of handguns, and shell casings were cataloged and compared against known records. The technology available at the time offered limited assistance, relying on manual comparison rather than automated systems. While the evidence could describe the violence, it could not yet name the men responsible. The surviving employee became central to the investigation. Though deeply traumatized, he was able to provide a structured account of the events. He described the men as calm, coordinated, and unhurried. Their movements suggested familiarity with robbery procedures, reinforcing the belief that the attack had been planned in advance rather than improvised. Detectives began comparing the massacre to other armed robberies across Los Angeles County. Reports were reviewed for similarities in entry style, verbal commands, and the number of participants. Particular attention was paid to crimes involving multiple suspects acting in coordination, especially those where victims were forced into back rooms or kitchens. As news coverage intensified, tips poured into the Glendale Police Department. Some callers reported seeing unfamiliar cars circling the area that night. Others identified acquaintances who vaguely matched descriptions provided in early press releases. Many of these leads proved unreliable, distorted by fear, rumor, or the desire to be helpful. Each tip required follow-up, stretching investigative resources thin. Police questioned former employees and frequent late-night patrons, exploring the possibility of personal grievances. These inquiries produced little. The victims were consistently described as ordinary workers with no history of conflict or threats. There was no indication the restaurant itself had been targeted for personal reasons. Gradually, a set of names began to surface. 3 young men known to associate with one another had been seen together in Glendale in the days leading up to the killings. All had prior arrests related to robbery and theft. None were known for restraint. Their criminal histories suggested escalation rather than coincidence. Surveillance was established as detectives tracked their movements. Friends and family members were questioned. Vehicles connected to the suspects were located and examined for weapons or evidence linking them to the crime. Investigators monitored behavior closely, watching for sudden travel, nervous activity, or attempts to dispose of property. One detail continued to trouble detectives. The small amount of money taken during the robbery did not justify the scale of violence. This reinforced the belief that intimidation and control, not profit, drove the crime. The massacre appeared less like desperation and more like assertion of power. As days turned into weeks, public pressure intensified. The restaurant remained closed, its windows covered, the crime scene lingering as a reminder. Community fear grew as residents wondered how 3 men could commit such violence and vanish. Behind the scenes, detectives worked long hours assembling fragments of information into a cohesive case. They believed the perpetrators were young, reckless, and increasingly dangerous. What they lacked was the piece that would turn suspicion into arrest. The suspects were coming into focus. Now the investigation needed proof. Chapter 4. Arrests and Confessions. By the 3rd week following the massacre, investigators believed they were closing in on the men responsible. Surveillance, interviews, and cross-reference tips had narrowed attention to a small circle of suspects whose movements and associations overlapped repeatedly in the days before and after the killings. These men were not unknown to police. Each had prior arrests for robbery and theft, and each had demonstrated a pattern of escalating behavior that concerned detectives reviewing their records. Formal interrogations began under controlled conditions, with suspects brought in separately and questioned for hours at a time. Detectives relied on a deliberate strategy of isolation, preventing the men from coordinating their stories and allowing contradictions to surface naturally. Statements were compared meticulously, not only for what was said, but for what was avoided. Minor discrepancies became leverage points, slowly eroding confidence as investigators pressed for clarification. The first confession emerged after prolonged questioning. One suspect began altering details about his whereabouts on the night of the crime, adjusting his story repeatedly as detectives confronted him with timelines assembled from witness statements and surveillance observations. Eventually, he admitted participation in the robbery itself, placing himself inside the restaurant during the attack. His account emphasized fear and passivity, framing his role as secondary and portraying the violence as the actions of others. The confession was incomplete, but it marked a turning point. Shortly afterward, a second suspect offered his own statement, which overlapped significantly with the first, while introducing new details. He described how the group selected Bob's Big Boy as a target, and acknowledged that firearms had been brought deliberately. Like the first, he attempted to distance himself from the killings, insisting that the plan had not included murder, and that events had escalated beyond his control. Together, the statements established a shared narrative of intent and presence. Both men placed themselves at the scene. Both confirmed the forced movement of employees into the kitchen. Both acknowledged that the victims were compliant when the shootings occurred. While each minimized personal responsibility, the combined accounts reinforced detectives' belief that the massacre had been intentional rather than accidental. The third suspect maintained his denial far longer. He rejected involvement entirely and accused the others of fabricating stories to protect themselves. Investigators countered with statements from acquaintances who placed the men together earlier that evening and again afterward. As contradictions mounted, his account shifted subtly, undermining its credibility, even without a full admission. Public announcement of the arrests brought temporary relief to Glendale. Headlines declared that the killers had been caught, and families of the victims were informed that formal charges were forthcoming. For the first time since the night of the massacre, there was a visible sense of movement toward accountability. Behind the scenes, however, prosecutors faced immediate complications. None of the suspects accepted responsibility for firing the fatal shots. Each confession was shaped by self-preservation, negotiation, and fear of severe sentencing. Determining individual culpability would require careful reconstruction of events and precise presentation of evidence. investigators worked to reinforce the case by refining timelines, re-interviewing witnesses, and re-examining ballistic findings. The goal was not only to prove participation, but to demonstrate intent clearly enough to withstand courtroom scrutiny. The complexity of the case became increasingly apparent as legal standards replaced investigative momentum. The arrests had closed one chapter of the investigation, but they opened another that would prove just as difficult. What appeared to be resolution on the surface concealed layers of uncertainty beneath. The massacre had horrified the city. Now the justice system would be tested by its aftermath. Chapter 5. The case moves to court. As the investigation transitioned into prosecution, the focus shifted from discovery to presentation. Detectives handed over their files, and prosecutors began the slow process of determining how the massacre would be argued before a jury. The brutality of the crime alone was not enough. The state would need to demonstrate intent, participation, and responsibility in a way that could survive legal scrutiny. The charges reflected the seriousness of the offense. Multiple counts of murder were filed, along with armed robbery charges that carried their own weight. From the beginning, prosecutors understood that the case would hinge not on whether the crime had occurred, but on assigning individual accountability for each death. That distinction would dominate every phase of the proceedings. Pre-trial hearings exposed the weaknesses embedded in the case. Defense attorneys immediately attacked the confessions, arguing they were the product of coercion, exhaustion, and fear. Interrogation lengths were questioned. Statement inconsistencies were highlighted. Each defense attempted to fracture the prosecution's narrative by isolating their client from the most damning moments of the crime. Prosecutors countered by emphasizing convergence rather than perfection. While the confessions varied in detail, they aligned on essential facts. The presence of all three men inside the restaurant, the use of firearms, the movement of employees into the kitchen, and the sequence of events leading to the shootings. Together, the statements created a composite picture stronger than any single account. Ballistic evidence played a supporting role, but could not resolve everything. The technology of the era limited precision, preventing investigators from definitively matching each fatal shot to a specific weapon or individual. This limitation complicated efforts to determine who fired which round, a question that carried enormous legal consequences. The courtroom atmosphere reflected the weight of the crime. Family members of the victims filled benches daily, listening as attorneys dissected the final moments of their loved ones' lives. The emotional toll was evident, yet proceedings remained procedural, governed by rules that often felt detached from the devastation they addressed. Witness testimony retraced familiar ground. The surviving employee described the terror of the kitchen and the helplessness of hiding in the freezer while gunfire echoed outside. His account anchored the prosecution's case emotionally, but it could not answer the legal question of individual responsibility. Defense strategies diverged. Each attorney worked to separate their client from the shootings themselves, portraying participation in the robbery as distinct from participation in murder. The argument was not innocence, but degree. Responsibility became something to be distributed, diluted, and contested. As testimony accumulated, the jury was presented with a complex moral and legal dilemma. The crime was undeniable, the suffering was visible, yet the law demanded precision. It required jurors to determine not only involvement, but intent, awareness, and foreseeability. The prosecution argued that bringing loaded weapons into a robbery carried inherent responsibility for the outcome. The defense argued that escalation was unplanned, and that intent to steal did not equate to intent to kill. Between those positions lay the verdict. Throughout the proceedings, the massacre itself loomed over every argument. The sheer number of victims shaped perception, even as the law attempted to compartmentalize actions into charges and counts. Justice, in this context, was not about restoring what had been lost, but about defining accountability after irreparable harm. As the trial progressed toward its conclusion, it became clear that whatever the verdict, it would not offer closure. The courtroom could determine guilt and impose punishment, but it could not undo the violence that had transformed a familiar restaurant into a site of permanent loss. The case was no longer about identifying the killers. It was about how the system would respond to what they had done. Chapter 6: Sentencing and Reckoning. When the trial concluded, the verdicts delivered a measure of legal resolution without offering emotional relief. The defendants were found guilty on multiple counts, including murder and armed robbery, confirming what the community already knew but still needed formally stated. The courtroom absorbed the outcome in silence, the weight of the decision settling unevenly across families, attorneys, and observers who understood that judgment did not equal restoration. Sentencing hearings followed, shifting attention once again from facts to consequences. Prosecutors argued for the harshest penalties available under California law, emphasizing the calculated nature of the crime and the irreversible loss inflicted on 5 families. They framed the massacre as an act that demanded clear denunciation, not only to punish the men responsible, but to affirm that such violence would not be minimized or rationalized. Defense attorneys responded by returning to familiar ground. They spoke of youth, of influence, of impulsivity, and of lives already shaped by poverty and instability. Responsibility was acknowledged in fragments, never fully claimed, always positioned as shared or diminished. The argument was not that the crime had not occurred, but that its meaning should be interpreted narrowly. The judge's remarks reflected the difficulty of the moment. The court acknowledged the limitations of sentencing in the face of mass death, noting that no punishment could balance what had been taken. Still, the law required a response, and that response would be severe. Lengthy prison terms were imposed, ensuring that the men would spend decades behind bars. For the families of the victims, the sentences brought a complicated mixture of validation and emptiness. Justice had been delivered in form, but grief did not recede. The absence at dinner tables remained. The finality of death continued long after the courtroom emptied. Public reaction followed a similar pattern. Headlines declared closure, yet the city felt changed. Bob's Big Boy reopened eventually, but the site carried memory whether acknowledged or not. For longtime residents, the massacre became a reference point, a moment that divided life into before and after. The case also left a mark on law enforcement. Officers involved in the investigation carried the images with them long after the file was closed. The massacre became a training example, a cautionary reminder of how quickly routine can collapse into catastrophe. Over time, the crime receded from national attention, but never disappeared locally. It lived in anniversaries, in quiet recollections, and in the way late-night restaurants were viewed thereafter. Safety was no longer assumed. Familiar spaces felt newly fragile. The legal system had done what it could within its boundaries. It identified perpetrators, imposed punishment, and closed the case. What it could not address was the randomness that haunted the event. The victims had not been targeted for who they were. They had simply been present. That truth lingered longer than any verdict. The Bob's Big Boy massacre was not remembered because it was mysterious. It was remembered because it was sudden, intimate, and devastatingly ordinary. It demonstrated how violence can enter without warning and leave behind a silence that never fully lifts. The case ended on paper. Its impact did not. Chapter 7. After the headlines. In the months that followed the sentencing, public attention slowly drifted away from the massacre, pulled toward newer crimes and fresher horrors. Newspapers stopped running follow-ups. Television stations archived the footage. What had once dominated front pages became a brief reference point, a name invoked only when violence elsewhere needed comparison. For Glendale, however, the event did not fade so easily. It settled into the city's memory as something unresolved emotionally, even if it was closed legally. Bob's Big Boy eventually reopened, restored to its familiar appearance with little outward acknowledgement of what had occurred. The booths were cleaned, the kitchen rebuilt, and the parking lot repaved. Yet for many residents, the building never returned to neutrality. Customers sat where victims had once worked. Late-night diners found themselves glancing toward the back hallway, aware of the history beneath the ordinary sounds of plates and conversation. Families of the victims continued living in the shadow of the crime long after official proceedings ended. Grief did not move in a straight line. Anniversaries reopened wounds. News articles resurfaced old photographs. Each reminder forced a return to the moment when routine shattered permanently. The court had delivered punishment, but it could not restore the futures that had been taken. For law enforcement, the case became a reference point rather than a mystery. It appeared in training discussions as an example of how quickly robberies could escalate, and how execution-style violence demanded immediate containment. Officers who had worked the scene spoke rarely about it, but when they did, it was with the tone reserved for moments that altered professional perspective. The massacre also shifted how late-night spaces were understood across Southern California. Restaurants adjusted closing procedures. Employees were trained differently. Panic buttons and cameras became more common. What had once been considered unnecessary precaution now felt prudent. The illusion of safety had been stripped away. Unlike unsolved crimes that invite endless speculation, the Bob's Big Boy massacre did not generate mythology. There were no competing theories, no shadowy suspects, no unanswered questions about who was responsible. The horror came not from uncertainty, but from clarity. The knowledge of exactly what happened offered no comfort. This distinction shaped how the crime was remembered. It did not become folklore. It became warning. A reminder that violence does not always arrive with symbolism or motive large enough to justify it. Sometimes it arrives because people with guns decide that witnesses should not be left behind. As years passed, the story survived primarily through local memory. It was passed quietly between residents, referenced in conversations about Glendale history, and recalled whenever discussions turned to crimes that permanently altered a community. The name remained heavy even when details faded. The massacre resisted narrative redemption. There was no lesson that made sense of it, no social shift that transformed it into progress. It stood as an interruption rather than a turning point. A night that did not lead anywhere, but simply ended lives. What endured was not fascination, but discomfort. The understanding that safety is conditional, that normalcy can dissolve without warning, that even the most familiar places can become scenes of irreversible loss. The story of Bob's Big Boy did not linger because it asked questions. It lingered because it answered one too clearly. Chapter 8. The End of the Night. Decades after the massacre, the facts of what happened inside Bob's Big Boy remain fixed. The timeline does not change. The names of the victims remain the same. The men responsible were identified, prosecuted, and removed from society. There is no missing evidence waiting to be discovered, and no revelation poised to rewrite history. What remains instead is the weight of an event that never asked to be remembered, yet refuses to disappear. Unlike cases that linger because they are unsolved, this one lingers because it was solved too cleanly. The machinery of justice functioned as intended. Arrests were made, trials were held, sentences were handed down, and still, the outcome feels unfinished. The finality of the verdicts did not quiet the sense that something fundamental had been broken. The victims were not symbols. They were not chosen for who they were. They were working a late shift at a neighborhood restaurant, performing ordinary tasks in a space designed for comfort and familiarity. Their deaths were not the result of obsession or personal grievance. They were the result of a decision made in minutes, carried out without hesitation, and justified only by convenience. That is what makes the massacre so difficult to absorb. There is no larger story to lean on, no ideology to confront, no mystery to untangle. The violence does not point outward toward meaning. It collapses inward, leaving only the knowledge that proximity was enough to seal fate. In the years that followed, Bob's Big Boy continued to exist as a functioning business and a recognizable landmark. Cars still pulled into the lot. Families still ate beneath the same lights. Yet beneath the routine, the memory persisted. Not loudly, not ceremonially, but quietly, in the way certain places never fully release what happened inside them. For the families of the victims, time did not soften the edges of loss. It merely changed its shape. Life continued, but absence remained permanent. No sentence length could measure what had been taken, and no public acknowledgement could restore the future that disappeared that night. The massacre did not redefine crime in America. It did not usher in sweeping reform. It did not become shorthand for an era. It existed instead as something more unsettling, proof that destruction does not require symbolism, spectacle, or reason grand enough to explain it. Sometimes, violence is not the result of complexity. Sometimes it is simply the worst possible decision made in an ordinary place. The night at Bob's Big Boy ended long ago, but its echo remains because it resists narrative comfort. There is no lesson that redeems it, no perspective that makes it necessary. It stands alone as an intrusion, a rupture that offers nothing except remembrance. We're looking at one of cases that stunned America, the January 6th insurrection. This is AI true crime. The intelligence is artificial, but the crime is real.
AI true crime. AI true crime. AI true crime. The intelligence is artificial. but the crimes are real. Intelligence is artificial, but the crimes are real. Intelligence is artificial,